Alrighty, everybody. It is currently Sunday, March 21st, 2026, and I am coming at you live from the Kingdom of Wallachia in the year 1462. And let me tell you something. These Wallachians, I think they're weak. I think we Ottomans are going to conquer them pretty easily. I think we're going to take them over, and they're really not going to do a whole lot of damage to us because we're the Ottomans, and they're just a shitty kingdom full of Slavs. Because today we are talking about medieval Romanian warfare, how they did it, what the setup is, what the epitome of medieval Romanian warfare was during its time. So we're going to start off. We're going to talk about the tenets of just broadly medieval warfare, specifically European medieval warfare. Then we're going to talk about the tenets of Romanian medieval warfare, what made it different from the rest of Europe, and some of the politics. We're going to get a little bit political. Hey, we're talking about gypsies, okay? I can't I can't talk about gypsies for an hour straight and not get a little bit political or a little bit, fanatically religious. I got to get something like that in there. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about one battle in particular that exemplifies, that is the epitome of medieval Romanian warfare. There's a few we could have chosen from. I chose one that I think people might, that's not as popular. It's a little bit more hidden, but it's just as much, an example of, a prime example of medieval Romanian warfare. And, I do hate to give the Romanians credit. I've talked about this before. I don't know if the Romanians are Slavic or what they are. I really don't consider non-Germanic Europeans white. I I don't know what it is. I got that old school, like, Benjamin Franklin mindset where Benjamin Franklin didn't even consider Germans white, which is fucking insane. Like I've heard a lot of racism. I've expressed a lot of racism, but not considering Germans white. Like Benjamin Franklin, he's, I think, the only two-parter we ever did. But he didn't consider Germans white, which is, he called them like tawny Palatine Boers or something like that. He did end up changing his tune up a little bit, but I think that's just because a bunch of German immigrants showed up to Pennsylvania at some point. But yeah, these are Romanians, and I think even the most liberal progressive people are kind of like, yeah, they're tech, and I don't know if there's a difference between Romanians and gypsies. I think maybe gypsies are just like a particular subset of Romanians. I know gypsy just broadly is a term that people will use for like kind of modern nomadic people who like to steal a lot, which, I'm not Catholic, never been baptized, but I was raised in Catholic school. I went to Catholic church every week for like, what, 8 years of my life growing up. And so I am still very culturally Catholic, very culturally Christian. And so I personally do believe that the gypsies have the right to steal. I believe that the gypsies are, divined by God with a birthright to be able to steal not anything they want, but if a gypsy stole a golf cart from me, I don't know if I would press charges. You know what I mean? Just in case what they say about them is true and that God did give them the right to steal, which, if you've never heard of this before, allegedly, when Jesus was getting crucified, when he was up on that hill and they were hammering the nails into him, apparently some gypsies, I think this is the story, some gypsies stole the nails. They stole the nails that were originally going to be used to crucify Jesus. Sorry, I'm burping a little bit. I just ate an entire bag of sunflower seeds and now it feels like I'm having a heart attack. So, got a little bit of acid reflux, but anyway. They say that gypsies, because they stole the nails that were going to be used to crucify Jesus, that they have like a holy right or a divine right to steal. Don't know how true that story is, don't know how many people believe it anymore, but I personally do believe it. I do believe that gypsies have the right to steal just in case. You know what I mean? You got to have a little bit of a little bit of just in case in you. Like I'll send up a prayer every once in a while. You know, really only exclusively to like the Christian God. Never prayed to any other kind of God, just because I don't know. Like the Muslim God, I don't know if I want to be in that heaven. You know, heaven with a bunch of Muslims does not sound like the greatest time. So I think I'll go to whatever other place. And I definitely don't want to be in heaven with a bunch of Jews. Oh my god. Could you imagine? Even in heaven, Jews would still complain. They'd still be, it's too hot. God, can you turn down the temperature? They'd still be fucking complaining. Even in heaven, they'd still find something to bitch about. So, you know, I don't want to go to Jewish heaven either. Heaven with a bunch of Indians. Well, I guess Indians are Hindus, so they kind of believe in reincarnation. You know what I mean? Samsara, the continuous cycle. But then, I don't know if Hinduism has like the ultimate nirvana like Buddhism does. But either way, I ain't trying to, you know what I mean? I don't want to be in heaven with a bunch of Indians either. So the Christian, the Christian route seems like the best route to me. I don't know. I'd rather be in heaven with Americans than any other group of people. Um, so yeah, I'll send up a prayer to him every once in a while, and I do fuck with the gypsies a little bit. You know, I'm not a big fan of a lot of the other type of Slavs. I don't know. They just seem so ethnic. that's that's really what it boils down to. And I guess the gypsies are pretty ethnic too. You know what I mean in terms of their refusal to let go of their backwards fucking European culture, but or just shitty European culture in general. Like even progressive European culture is it's way shitty. Like all their politics, all their culture, all of it is just so much shittier than America, dude. America really is the best. I mean, like I get it. People want to hate on the big dog. We're number one, so people want to hate on us. But goddamn, we really are the best. I, like I don't know how someone could come to this country and not be like, oh, this is clearly the best one. They clearly figured it out. I'm just gonna scrap my whole, whatever country I come from, India, Pakistan, Mexico. I'm just gonna scrap that whole shit and just kind of do what these guys are doing because clearly it worked out for them. I don't know how anyone. I don't know how someone can come from a country where you can't drink the water and then be like, no, but my country rules. You know what I mean? Like, and still hold on to their culture like that. I don't know. I don't know how they can justify that in their heads. But anyway, anyway, I do believe in the gypsies' divine right to steal, like I said. But these guys, I don't know how gypsy-ish they are, because aren't the gypsies from like India or some shit, and then they pulled up to Romania, or they're from somewhere like the Middle East or some shit. They're not like historically like an entrenched European group. So I don't know if all Romanians are gypsies or if just Romania has the most amount of gypsies. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but I feel like gypsies are the one group that Europeans still are pretty racist towards. And, to that I say have fun in hell. Have fun in hell because God gave those motherfuckers the right to steal copper wire out of traffic lights and stuff. Okay? That's God. God, when Jesus was on the cross and that dude stabbed him with the spear and the water came out, Jesus was like, let him take your golf cart, dude. Just let the boys have your golf cart. The boys and the girls. Let them have the golf cart, okay? Let them take a DeWalt drill out of the back of your truck. It's their divine right. God said so. God said they can have your table saw. Right? God said they're allowed to take carpentry tools out of the back of work vans and sell them at pawn shops. I'm pretty sure that's like what, Revelations 12:11. Gypsies are allowed to steal angle grinders and sell them for a quarter of what they're worth at the nearest pawn shop. Revelations 12:11. Don't believe me? Look it up. Look it up. But yeah, these guys do seem to be a bit more honorable than that. But they're still not. We'll talk about it. They don't really give a shit about honor. You know what I mean? When your country is about to get taken over, you don't really. Honor kind of goes out of the window. You could have honor when you're like invading the Holy Land and you have like a fallback plan where you're like, I can go back to France or England or Italy or whatever. But when your country's getting invaded, the whole chivalry thing kind of goes out of the window. And to be perfectly honest, knights themselves, uh, like Western European knights, were not always the best example of chivalry, but we'll talk about that. So these are just, we're starting off with some of the most basic tenets of just broadly medieval European warfare, specifically like Western Europe. Eastern Europe kind of had its own thing going on, especially they had a lot of influence from the Mongols. And so they were big fans of what's called light cavalry. We're going to talk about heavy cavalry because that's really important for Western European warfare. But over in Eastern Europe, like the Polish, the Lithuanians, probably the Estonians and the Russians and shit like that, they were big fans of the light cavalry. And we're going to talk about, I guess, a little bit about how that got phased out and people realized just sprinting into other people full speed really isn't the best plan all the time. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you do need to sprint into someone full speed with just like a fucking hammer, just a big old sledgehammer, big old Looney Tunes mallet, just bonk a dude on the head. Sometimes you got to do that, but doing that all the time, it's predictable. That's ultimately what it comes down to. It's predictable. And so, yeah, tenets of Western medieval European warfare, we'll say. So most soldiers that were fighting in these medieval wars were there on feudal obligations, which is basically like, we talked a little bit, I did like a mini episode about feudalism, but it's basically like the king gives a lord some land, and then the lord, I think he pays the king some tribute, but he also he himself will go and fight for the king, and then he'll like get a bunch of dudes together to go and fight for the king. Sometimes it's knights, but most of the time it is just like shitty peasants with like spears or whatever. Not even spears, just like nunchucks basically. They'll get a bunch of those dudes together and go and fight for the king, or else the king will like invade the lord and take his land away and stuff like that. And sometimes it works out well for the king. Sometimes the king gets his taxes and he gets the dudes he needs to fight the wars he wants to fight. Sometimes the lords are like, well, if your entire military or like the bulk of your military comes from me and my boys, all the other lords that are chilling around here, fuck you, we're not going to send any knights. And so basically, kind of the point here is that the dudes fighting for these kings or fighting for these lords they're not there because they want to be there. That's kind of what it comes down to. They don't give a shit about fighting, the French. Like, we'll talk about the 100 Years' War a little bit, use that as an example. Yeah, they do have, there is a sense of like national pride and like probably a lot of propaganda, specifically like religious propaganda, being like, this is, God wants you to do this, like your king, the King of England or the King of France or whatever, he's divined by God or whatever, God speaks through him, and if the king is telling you to fight, that's basically the same as God telling you to fight. They do really believe in that sort of stuff, but I mean, if shit comes to fuck, you know what I mean? They're probably not the most loyal people on the face of the planet. Maybe some of the knights and some of the higher up guys are, but a lot of the bulk of your army, you know what I mean? Your infantry guys, they're going to be like, fuck this. They're going to see a bunch of, roided out, or I guess not roided out, they didn't have roids back in medieval times, but a bunch of huge ass dudes like riding at them with like swords and axes on the back of horses, and they're going to be like, fuck this. You know what I mean? Or if the war starts going on too long, they're going to be like, fuck this, and they're going to do what they can to get out of there. They do, they do have that peasant mindset, a little bit of, I'm just like a slave, I'm a servant, I need to serve this guy no matter what. There is a little bit of that, but they're not like super hyper ultra loyal, which is kind of going to be a contrast when we talk about medieval Romanian warfare and really medieval Balkan warfare as a whole. They're a little bit more, guys are a little bit more loyal, and they're fighting for their land, whereas a lot of these guys were fighting to economically cripple other countries and stuff like that. That's what a lot of these wars were about. So anyway, these soldiers, they would also serve like temporarily over a fixed time on campaigns that were usually pretty short. So it would be like, you know what I mean? It was all, the whole feudal system was, it was all figured out like that. It would be like, okay, I'm the king, you pay me this amount of taxes, you give me this amount of dudes to fight in your army for this amount of time, blah 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 blah. It was all it was all kind of pre-decided because it could be pre-decided. Like I said, a lot of these guys weren't fighting to defend their land. They weren't fighting to defend their homes and stuff like that. They were fighting so that some king somewhere could plunder, you know, some shitty Eastern European kingdom and get all their gold and all their oxes and all their horses and stuff like that. That's what a lot of these dudes in Western Europe were doing. And some of them really did believe in it. Some of them really were like, God wants me to do this. If I don't do this, I'm going to go to hell. And they also had like that brainwashed medieval peasant mindset that I was talking about. But probably enough of them, the kings and the lords and stuff, probably knew that enough of these guys were independent thinkers to the point where they were like, yeah, I'm not going to sprint into basically a wall of spears so that you can have a bunch of gold from, you know, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or whatever example we're talking about. In a lot of these common soldiers, plundering and looting, that's very big during this time, because the point of a lot of these wars, like I was saying earlier, was kind of to economically cripple your enemies, to just steal all their gold and all their land and all their resources to the point where they just can't sustain the war anymore, and then some sort of peace deal is brokered that favors the people who still can sustain the war. That's kind of the goal of a lot of these battles. And so a lot of these battles aren't really even battles. It's just a bunch of knights pulling up on some village somewhere and stealing everything they can, including people, which we'll talk about. They're more so skirmishes, we'll say, than they are, you know, the big pitched battles that you're thinking about where the knights lower their lances on both sides and then they just ride into each other and clash. There is a fair amount of that, but that's more so, those are the decisive battles as opposed to the, you know, nickel and diming that most of the medieval warfare is. Most of medieval warfare, and I would guess warfare now, is just kind of nickel and diming you guys. Nickel and dime them down until they're too economically weak to continue to fight. And so another thing that's really big in Western European medieval warfare is heavy cavalry. So heavy cavalry, aka knights, that's kind of the job that knights do at this point, were the elite shock force. They were used to smash through enemy lines, and their service was often motivated by nobility and honor. So yeah, knights were, they were some level of nobility. Some of them were like the son of the king and stuff like that. Some of them were lower level nobility, but they had some sort of like noble blood in them. Really, you're not going to find an example of a knight that doesn't have any noble blood. Sometimes it is like a really shitty nobility. Like there's this one guy that we might talk about a little later on in this episode, Jan Ziska. He was a Bohemian knight, I think in the 16th century. And he was from like a really shitty noble family. Like his his coat of arms, it wasn't like an eagle or a lion or a dragon or some shit like that. Like it was a crawfish, not even a lobster. It was a shitty fucking crawfish. But he was some type of nobility. And so heavy cavalry it's a job. So knight is a title, but heavy cavalry is a job. It's a purpose you serve in war. And the purpose of heavy cavalry is, in this time, it's two dudes lining up in like a predetermined location, and then they're just fighting over that, seeing who can kill more dudes, who can capture more dudes, all that sort of stuff. And so the heavy cavalry's job is to just, boom, take off. You're covered in armor. You can't, like the arrows, some of the crossbows at the time, I think, were powerful enough to pierce through chainmail and plate armor and stuff like that, but arrows can't really hurt you. You're not going to get cut by a sword or anything like that. You might get your head bashed in by a mace or something, or some dude might get a lucky shot and get that sword through to your neck or something like that. But you're basically a fucking tank. That's what heavy cavalry was during this time. They were basically tanks that were pretty immune to any sort of like immediate like first wave of attack. I'll say you can wear them down over time and kill them eventually, but you know, 2 or 3 arrows ain't gonna do the job. You're gonna really have to beat the fuck out of these guys to get them to die. So heavy cavalry just goes through, smashes through the line, whole bunch of fighting, and then I guess the other dudes rush in and start stabbing each other and beating each other to death and all that good shit. And like I said, these knights were motivated by like proving themselves. That was kind of the point of what they were doing. They were like, you know, if you were like a nobleman and you never served as a knight or anything like that, you were kind of looked down upon, you know, in terms of nobility and masculinity and things like that. So these knights are maybe a little bit more motivated to fight and all that good shit, but they're more so motivated by like a like personal gain than they are, you know, the kingdom and stuff like that. They're motivated by personal gain, maybe like familial gain, but they, you know, you look at medieval history, a lot of these kings and stuff like that, and even popes and stuff, were overthrown by their own knights, their own, or whatever their equivalent of a knight was. You know, they would just be like, all right, I've had enough of this shit. I've never really been fighting for you. I've kind of been just fighting for myself, you know, so I'm just going to overthrow you, beat you to death, kill you with hammers, or hold you for ransom. That's another big thing that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Ransom is huge in medieval Europe. And so next thing we're going to talk about castles. So castles were the centers of political control as well as defensive strongholds. And so they were incredibly important for controlling land as well. And thus, so was siege warfare. And siege warfare is it's probably the shittiest type of warfare overall. You know, trench warfare is basically just like, it's basically the exact same as siege warfare. It's just two dudes on either side that are both dug in as hard as they can be, just kind of waiting each other out. In siege warfare, you know, you're thinking like catapults, trebuchets, flaming arrows, and stuff like that. Another very important part of siege warfare that most people don't know about is these mines that they would build. So imagine a castle, you got a big old wall around the castle, and you know, there's some other like shitty huts or whatever up in there. You need to get through that wall. If you get through the wall, basically the siege is over. That's the entire point of a siege, is getting past that wall. You know, I guess you could, you know, a lot of sieges do end with the people inside kind of being starved out, running out of resources and stuff like that. And I'm sure you could just launch a bunch of rocks in there and kind of destroy everything, but you're trying to take this castle, right? You're trying to take this castle so that you can control all the land around the castle, right? And you also want to plunder and loot it and all that good shit. So you really don't want to destroy it as a whole. You want to get in there, slaughter the people, have some fun, maybe take a few people for ransom. And so you really just want to destroy the wall. And so one way that they would do this was they would dig these mines, and they would figure out when they were underneath the wall, and they would set up all like a bunch of firewood and stuff, and then they'd light the wood on fire, and that would like collapse the ground and then collapse the wall that was above the ground. And obviously the dudes inside the castle aren't going to take this laying down, and so they would dig counter mines, which, yeah, it's exactly, they would just tunnel around like fucking Bugs Bunny until they found the mine that was being dug to destroy the wall in that section. And it was pretty fucking brutal. It was pretty, when two mines would you know, crash into each other, you know, no one's got night vision goggles. We're going by like candle light and stuff like that, and that candle is going to be the first thing you drop when you see a dude fucking smash through the dirt wall with a shovel, getting ready to beat you to death. So these dudes are like in the dark, beating each other to death. A lot of them would be armed, like it was a test of masculinity for knights to go down into the mines and fight with each other. So sometimes you would have some of that, but sometimes it would just be dudes with shovels and pickaxes and shit just beating each other to death. That's a lot of what it was, just stabbing each other in the head with pickaxes. So yeah, siege warfare was pretty fucking brutal, and it would also just drain people. It would drain resources, not just from that castle, but like I said, when the dudes break in, they're killing people, so that's a lot of soldiers that you're losing. You're getting, if you're a king or whatever, if you're a lord, you're getting all your money stolen, and then obviously the king is taxing that shit, and so the king is losing money. So yeah, siege warfare is very important, and we could do a whole episode about it. We could do a whole episode about siege warfare. Romanians, they're kind of like, fuck that. Really, all of this shit comes down to the Romanians being like, yeah, we're not doing that. We know we can't do it. We don't have the knights in the castle, so we're just not going to do that. And we'll explain how they avoid doing that while still being good at war, or decent at war. They're not great, they're not horrible, but they're just very unique. And look, Romania still fucking exists, despite getting fucked from two directions. They're getting spit roasted, or whatever it's called, and they still managed to survive, so worked out well for them. And so, next thing that's really important for medieval Western European warfare is the Catholic Church. So with the Catholic Church, war was often used as a holy cause, and the church would try to control and regulate violence with varying degrees of success. So this is important because, like I was talking about earlier, a lot of these peasants and even some of these knights and stuff like that are seeing what they're doing as a holy cause. They're like, God wants me to do this. The Pope speaks through God. The Pope is like or God speaks through the Pope, sorry. The Pope is kind of the ultimate guy. I need to listen to him and go out there and fight for God. The other part of this is, like the non-religious part, I guess, is the church is super powerful. Like, the church is the ultimate. All the kings and stuff kind of have to listen to the church to a certain extent, Obviously, we know that English, they end up not listening to the church and being like, fuck you, we're just gonna make our own religion. There was another group of people that, called the Hussites, that kind of did a similar thing. And so, yeah, the church has a ton of money, and then they also have the religious influence. So people that are legitimately religious, various crusaders, although a lot of the crusaders in their actions kind of prove how not religious they are. Catholic Church has a lot of influence over this. And this is important because Romania, there's 3 different kingdoms that we're going to talk about that are ethnically Romanian and that end up, kind of coming together to create the country of Romania. They're not Catholic. So they can kind of be like, fuck you. We don't have to listen to you. We've never had to listen to you. And then it's kind of shitty also because Catholic people, they would fight each other, but when they had a common enemy, they would come together and help each other out and stuff like that. And obviously, Romania being Orthodox, they don't get as much of that. They get a little bit of it, but not really. They're not getting money from like the big, I guess one of the big power players. But yeah, they don't have that at their back, but that's also a benefit because they kind of can tell the church to fuck off. I don't have to listen to you. And so, next thing that's super important for Western European medieval warfare, and really medieval warfare as a whole, is capturing troops. Specifically, nobles was very important for both diplomacy and ransom. And this is because war is super fucking expensive. Like I was talking about earlier. We think of medieval warfare, we think of knights, lances, longbows, crashing into each other at full speed. Really, most of it was just trying to bleed the other country dry through whatever means necessary. If bleeding them dry meant meeting them on the battlefield and just sprinting at each other full speed and beating each other to death, then they would do that. But for the most part, it was a lot of small skirmishes between lords and stuff like that. And so they would capture these lords. Sometimes kings got captured, and they would ransom them back. Just another way of bleeding them dry, and also giving your knights something to fight for. That's the other part of this. Plundering, looting, and taking nobles for ransom is a good way to make money and a good way to give your knights some money so that they don't turn on you. It's really an overall win for you. Money is always good, is kind of the point of this little section here. And then it's also important for diplomacy, because if you capture the king, I mean that's what chess is. Chess is like the most famous, I guess analog for warfare that people talk about, or at least like large scale warfare strategy. Chess is kind of the ultimate analog for that. And what's the point of chess? You capture the king. If you capture the king, basically you won the entire thing, right? It's how you win at chess. It's kind of how you win at war too. But if you get like a prince or something like that, war might still be going on, but that's like taking the queen. You know what I mean? Or taking both the guy's rooks or whatever. You got a pretty good chance of winning if you take both of the rooks. If you take a prince, you got a pretty good chance that things are gonna work out for you positively. And so next thing we're going to talk about is command structure. So command structure was usually fragmented, with members of the nobility leading their own troops how they chose, and this could lead to issues with coordination, especially within large coalitions, right? King is like, hey, Edward III, was he the one who started the 100 Years' War? I don't really remember. English king is like, hey, we're going to go fight France. Lords, you need to get a bunch of dudes together and we're going to go fight over there. And the lords would be like, fuck yeah. And it would be all the lords, and they would go over there and they would go and fight France and plunder and stuff like that. But all these troops that the lords bring with them, they're obviously more loyal to the lords than they are to the king. And the lords, some of them are like full chivalry, like don't kill civilians, don't plunder and loot unnecessarily and all that stuff, don't burn down churches, don't commit ethnic cleansing. Some of the guys are like that. Some of the other guys are like, do whatever you want as long as you give me money. And that's more so the popular way of doing things, is being like, yeah, you guys can kind of do whatever you want as long as you end up bringing me back a little piece of what you're getting. And yeah, it leads to a lot of people, a lot of troops abandoning shit, a lot of troops going off and doing their own thing, kind of ruining the whole big plan that the king's got. It's not super common, but it's common enough that the king kind of has that on his mind, being like, these dudes might they might go off and go on a tear. Or maybe it's like the troops of a certain lord destroy a city or whatever, and that ends up pissing off the other king, and now all your negotiations are fucked up. It's a big thing you got to worry about. So yeah, overall medieval warfare in Europe, especially Western Europe, was based on seasonal conflicts. You cannot fight in the winter at this point. Food, disease, the cold. You just can't fight in the winter. Large open battles, those aren't as common, but they are important for determining the outcome of the war. In an open battle, like I was talking about earlier, just two dudes or two sides facing off with each other, lowering the lances and being like, I'm going to beat you to death before you beat me to death, essentially. And sieges. Sieges are very important. Control of land is very important. Very, very important. You want to control the land so that your opponent, whoever you're facing, does not have food to eat, or whatever it may be, whatever is important on that piece of land. They can't go up the river around that piece of land or whatever it is. And also the maintenance of power, maintaining that sort of feudal structure of nobility. You got your peasants, you got your lower nobility, your higher nobility, and then the king at the top. Maintaining that is super important, because if you don't maintain that, then the peasants are kind of going to be like, are we slaves I mean, they call us peasants, they call us serfs, but we're not allowed to leave. We have to work all the time. We really get all of our money stolen by the Lord, and he calls it taxes. Are we slaves? And then they're going to have a peasant uprising. And so you need to maintain that social, noble structure. Very important. So those are kind of the very basic tenets of Western European medieval warfare. Now we're going to talk about the basic tenets of medieval Romanian warfare. And to understand those, we kind of got to talk about what is Romania during this time. Like I said earlier, it's 3 different kingdoms. So are they friends with each other? Yeah, kind of. Not a little bit, they're friends with each other. What sort of political situation are these kingdoms in, and how does that, affect the way that they conduct warfare? So we'll talk about that. So the Romanian kingdoms of Wallachia, it's spelled Wallachia, but you pronounce it Wallachia. I'm going to say Wallachia because if you wanted me to pronounce it as a V, you should have put a V there. I don't know, suck my dick. So Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania were essentially buffer states between Catholic Europe and the Muslim Ottomans for a time. Before that, they were kind of they weren't a buffer state at all, actually. The buffer state before that was the Byzantines. Obviously, Romania was still there, but they weren't really a buffer state. They were just kind of an extension of that Orthodox shit that they had going on. But after the fall of Constantinople, they become the buffer states between the Catholics and the Ottomans. And that's mostly what we're going to be talking about, that period when they were the buffer state between the Catholics and the Ottomans. Because that's when they're really fighting each other. Or that's when they're really going to war and stuff like that. So yeah, that's very important. Transylvania, you've probably heard of that one before. Moldavia, I guess technically they're pretty big kingdoms. The overall area that these kingdoms cover, I think, is a little bit bigger than modern Romania. And so I do think the country of Moldova, which is a modern country that exists now, it was at one point a part of Moldavia, and they just split off. And all these people, Romania doesn't exist as a country yet, but they are all ethnically, culturally Romanian. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is Transylvania. It's the most famous one, but it's really, when we're talking about medieval Romanian warfare and their, the purpose that they serve as a buffer state, it's not really the most important. So Transylvania was a part of the Kingdom of Hungary and thus was the most like Western Europe in terms of politics and warfare, and it was also more ethnically and religiously diverse. So Hungary now, you're thinking of like that shitty little Slavic country in Eastern Europe. During this time, it's a whole lot bigger. You know what I mean? I think it's even bigger than the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which I'm trying to think of when that formed. I don't really know when that formed, but Hungary's pretty fucking big, and it's really fucking Catholic. Transylvania, it's kind of autonomous. Sometimes it's fully autonomous. Sometimes it's just kind of autonomous, and then sometimes it's just fully a part of Hungary. But it borders right up against Hungary, and so Hungary is always there kind of as a big brother. And Transylvania also does not border the Ottoman Empire kind of really ever. Sometimes I guess you could say it kind of does. It does end up bordering like Ottoman like puppet states, right? It ends up bordering some of those, but never really borders like the full might of the Ottoman Empire. It always has Wallachia is kind of, and Moldavia are kind of always in between Transylvania and the Ottomans. So Transylvania, it's our first one. It's basically a part of Hungary. There is a ton of Romanian people living there, but the people that actually control Transylvania are Catholics for the most part during this time period that we're talking about. And then some Protestants kind of come in later, and then I guess it joins up with Romania, and it's also pretty ethnically diverse. Next one we got coming up here is Moldavia. So Moldavia was an independent kingdom that bordered Poland, Lithuania, which Poland and Lithuania kind of teamed up, had this thing called the Poland Lithuanian Commonwealth for a while. Not super important to what we're talking about here. Hungary. Hungary is really important in all of this when we're talking about these medieval Romanian kingdoms. Hungary is very influential over them, especially Wallachia. And these guys do actually border the Ottomans. Transylvanians don't border the Ottomans. Moldavians do border the Ottomans. And it was fairly politically stable and used mountains and fortified monasteries in war. The battle and the guy that we're going to be talking about that are kind of the epitome of medieval Romanian warfare, they're Moldavian. And all of these areas are pretty mountainous. And they're all in like the Balkan type of area, around the Black Sea, Turkey, kind of. That's where these kingdoms are at. So yeah, that's Moldavia. Fairly politically stable. There's a little bit of instability, but look, it's medieval times. A dude could just show up with like 300 guys, and if they were good enough, he could become a king. So, in terms of all that, decently politically stable. Whew. And then this is our big boy right here. This is the one that most people probably know a guy who's from this country. Don't want to spoil anything, but you might know a guy who's from this kingdom. So Wallachia was the first line of defense against the Ottomans after Constantinople fell. We'll talk a little bit about that. In 1453, that's when Constantinople fell and was under pressure from Hungary and the Ottomans for tribute, which made its politics pretty unstable at times. They do. It's pretty fucking complicated. I might put a link to another podcast in the description of this one that you can go and listen to if you want, about the whole situation that was going on between Wallachia, this love triangle that we had between Wallachia, Hungary, and the Ottomans. Sometimes the Wallachians were like, oh, we're on Hungary's side. Oh, we're on the Ottoman side. And they would like submit to them and pay tribute to them. Ultimately, I'll say they do end up teaming up a little bit more with the Hungarians. The Hungarians are Christians. They are kind of oppressing the Romanian people in Transylvania, but the Ottomans are probably going to do a whole lot worse than just oppress people. So they do kind of end up teaming up with Hungary, and also they're Christians, so they have that in common. Like I said, the Catholics would fuck with the Orthodox a fair bit, just like jab at them, you know what I mean? Loot a couple cities here and there. But when it came to fighting Muslims, the Orthodox and the Catholics would ultimately team up with each other. And even a lot of the Catholics had beef with each other. There was just a lot of beef back then, dude. Europe was just a big ball of beef. Everyone was always beefing about some shit. And so Wallachia is the most... I wrote this down, but I don't really know how true it is. It's kind of... Wallachia and Moldavia, we'll say, are the most unique of the three in terms of warfare, and the fact that it was Orthodox made its relationship with Western Europe contentious at times. But that really applies to Wallachia and Moldavia. Transylvania, I don't mean to shit on the guys. They are Romanian for sure. Like, I'm not going to deny their Romanianness, but they don't really act how the Romanians are acting in this time, I'll say, or how the other two Romanian kingdoms are acting, because they're not fully independent, right? Wallachia it's kind of south of these mountains. I forget what the mountains are called. The Carpathians, maybe? I don't remember what they're called. But they're south of these mountains, and Transylvania is north of these mountains. And so Transylvania doesn't really have that line of natural defense, so they end up getting kind of absorbed by the more powerful Kingdom of Hungary. And then obviously Wallachia and Moldavia, they're a little bit further away. They don't end up getting, they've got that natural border of mountains there, so they don't end up getting conquered by the Hungarians. the Ottomans do get in there a little bit. We'll talk about that. The Ottomans are a little bit more successful um, during this time. Fuck it, we'll talk about that later. Anyway, so Romanian leaders made use of the mountainous terrain, avoiding open pitch battles and instead opting to hit and run, do ambushes, and harass the enemy. There's a ton of different ways that they do this. A big one, Sun Tzu, The Art of War. You know, most people have heard of that guy. Most people probably know a few quotes from that. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Romania kind of disproves that, you know. Sometimes they kind of disprove that because they're enemies with Hungary, but they also hate the Ottomans. They just love Romania, essentially, right? Like they're ultra nationalist. They're ultra, you know, like proud of their ethnicity and willing to do anything for their independence, right? Or willing to do anything to maintain their independence. That's kind of Romania's thing. They're just, during this time, they're just hard headed as hell. Like they could have joined up with Hungary at any point, and essentially been like satellite states for Hungary that Hungary, you know, sends people to defend, but they don't. They want to be independent. They are kind of snaky sometimes, but everyone knows they're snaky, right? Everyone knows they're like kind of fucking around and lurking in the shadows, and you can trust them. You can trust them to act in their own best interest all the time, right? Like they might fuck you over, but it's going to be a predictable fuck over, right? Because they're going to fuck you over not to help the Ottomans. They don't want to help the Ottomans or the Hungarians. They want to help themselves. And so when you're dealing with the Romanian kingdoms at this time, just politically, like, you know, political big picture, you're probably going to get fucked over, but you're not going to get fucked over in a way that it helps your enemies, I guess is the way I'll put it. But anyway, yeah, guerrilla warfare, hit and run, ambushes, things like that, harassment, that's a big thing they'll do. They'll find like some shitty little camp that you're chilling in. They're not going to face, they're always outnumbered. No matter what, the Romanians are always vastly outnumbered, basically in every single engagement that they end up in. They're outnumbered to shit, dude. And so they'll just find like a little camp or whatever, and they'll burn it to the ground, take a bunch of dudes prisoner, execute a bunch of guys, do whatever the fuck they want. They're a big fan of hitting supply lines, especially a guy that we'll end up talking about later. He's a big fan of hitting supply lines, poisoning wells, burning shit to the ground. They'll just do that and then run away because they know they can't beat you one-on-one, which, yeah, they're just not fighting now. Even the Ottomans are kind of fighting in the traditional medieval style that you're thinking of just getting on horses and just riding into you. Romanians aren't doing that. And so Romanian forces were hypermobile and relied on tactical retreats and scorched earth tactics rather than static castle-based defense. Really, Wallachia, we'll talk about Wallachia and how they kind of use this to their advantage. But like we talked about a little bit earlier with Moldavia and their fortified monasteries, I guess they are doing a little bit of castle-based defense there, or like stronghold-based defense, but for the most part, they're going to be pretty mobile in what they're doing. You know what I mean? And those monasteries really aren't going to be under siege that much. They're on top of fucking mountains, dude. No one wants to climb a mountain to fight them. We'll just try to kill all these guys when they're outside of the castle. And so, yeah, they would basically tactical retreats. They were a big fan of tactical retreats is essentially what this means. And like the Russians, a big fan of the scorched earth thing. They were very big fans of that because they knew that their people were hard-headed enough to get through that. They knew that they would let their children starve to death and stuff like that if it meant, Wallachia or Moldavia was able to maintain its independence. And so another thing that they have in common with the Russians that we kind of talked about is that they would trade land for time, and they use the denial of resources through scorched earth tactics and supply line hits as a form of defense, right? They're not going to stop you with a big old wall. That's Western Europe and the Ottomans and stuff like that. They'll just build a giant wall and a bunch of ditches and moats and stuff like that, and that's how they'll stop you. Not the Romanians. The Romanians are going to stop you by hitting your supply lines, denying you resources, killing enough guys to get you scared, but not enough to where they lose any of their own guys or a bunch of their own guys. That's just how they do it. That's their version of defense. Their version of defense isn't, sit there and take the hits. They're not George Foreman or whatever. They don't have like a big old iron shin where they can just get the shit beat out of them and not get knocked out. They're Mike Tyson. They're bobbing and weaving, avoiding hits. Boom, little jab there. And then sometimes they end up having the power to throw an uppercut and knock you out, sometimes, or knock you down at the very least. So I guess that's what I would compare it to. They're not Rocky. They can't just sit in the pocket and take punches the whole time. They'll get right up on you, but they're going to be bobbing and weaving, moving back and forth, doing what they have to do to not get hit. They would rather not get hit than take a hit and be able to throw one back, because they're smaller. They're not going to be able to throw as big of a hit as you can. So they're just going to kind of wear you down over time. And they fuck with you mentally. That's a big thing that they're a fan of. So, next thing, Romanian soldiers fought for Romania. Not just in terms of like who they fought for on paper, who they were loyal to on paper. They were loyal to Romania. Oftentimes this meant being loyal to like whoever the leader of their particular kingdom was at that time. But even the kings were super loyal to their countries. Like I said, they refused to like truly submit to Hungary or the Ottomans. They would pay them tribute and shit like that. Sometimes they did some kind of dumb things when they were tactically submitting, I guess is how you'll put it. But they're not going to ever truly submit to you. Their forces were composed mostly of light cavalry. They don't have a ton of heavy cavalry. They have light cavalry, which is you're still on a horse, but you're not armored or you don't have a ton of armor or anything like that. Infantry and other irregular troops, a lot of whom were mercenaries. Sometimes this works out for the Romanians, sometimes it doesn't. Like I was talking about earlier, they would submit to the larger kingdoms that surrounded them, and specifically Hungary would send them, mercenaries or troops loyal to them. Sometimes they would just give them money, and then the Romanian kingdoms would hire mercenaries and stuff like that, which, thing about that is those mercenaries are going to be pretty loyal to you because you're how they get money, right? But then after the war is over, right, after you're done paying them, they're just going to leave. And so after the mercenaries leave, whatever force you're fighting, usually it's the Ottomans, they're just going to be like, all right, the mercenaries left, so now your army is lost 25% of its men. Okay, well, we're just going to invade now. Sometimes it works out for them, sometimes it doesn't. Just is what it is. So yeah, no heavy cavalry, I guess, is the main point of that. So a lot of the things that medieval European warfare is based on, sieges, heavy cavalry, open pitched battles, Romanians just don't do any of that. They're not doing any of that. They're also not in it for the money. They're truly loyal to their countries, their religion, their ethnicity. They're loyal to that, as opposed to these other guys, which a lot of them were just in it for the money. Next up, psychological warfare. I wrote psychology warfare. I don't know, this is like page 4 of the notes, so I was pretty tired, I guess. So I wrote psychology warfare, but psychological warfare. Psychological warfare was used to demoralize and deter invading forces, and it could include public displays of punishment. Like I said, there's a pretty famous example of that, and abandoning cities, often to great success. Like I was talking about earlier, they'll trade land for time, which is kind of crazy. These are pretty small kingdoms, like I was talking about earlier. They do have the benefit of being able to go to like Hungary, that was We'll talk about a guy who did that. They do have that benefit, but they're not like Russia. Like Russia can fall back infinitely east, pretty much for all intents and purposes. They don't really have that benefit that the Russians have of like that huge territory where there's not a lot of shit in that territory that they're retreating into, but at least it's theirs. You know what I mean? And they can just keep falling back. These guys kind of have to just run around in circles while they're getting chased, or go to another kingdom that is better defended. So the best example that I could think of, at least, of this very effective psychological warfare was when Vlad III Dracula of Wallachia impaled 20,000 Ottomans on the road to Targoviste, which is the capital of Wallachia, which the Ottomans eventually reached only to find the city completely fucking abandoned. So, right now, I'll take a break real quick and then I'll come back. Alright, now I'm going to explain basically the entire life story of Vlad III Dracula up until the events of him impaling all these dudes and abandoning Torqueviste. So Vlad III Dracula, he's the son, you're never going to guess this, of Vlad II Dracula. And like I said earlier, Wallachia and Moldavia would kind of tactically submit to other countries, right? The Ottomans would be like, you need to pay me tribute. Sometimes it was the Hungarians would be like, you need to pay me tribute. Vlad II ended up kind of capitulating to the Ottomans. And so Vlad III, along with his brother Radu, who would go on to be known as Radu the Handsome, part of that submission from Vlad II was he sent Vlad III and Radu to be hostages, basically. They weren't treated like hostages. They were actually treated pretty well by the Ottomans. The Ottomans taught them their language. They tried to get them to convert. Radu, he does end up converting. Vlad, he might have done like a little bullshit conversion, but he was always a big fan of the Orthodox. Taught them their language, taught them a lot of military strategy, which is... They basically treated them like the other nobles. I assume to like maintain that good relationship with the king of, in this instance, Wallachia, but they were treated pretty well. Eventually, Vlad III ends up going back to Wallachia. I don't remember exactly how it happens, but he ends up back in Wallachia, and he's like, fuck it. We're going to war with the Ottomans, bitches. Not fully. He goes back, reclaims the throne. At one point, the throne had been stolen out of his family, but he goes back, takes the throne of Wallachia, and the Ottomans are like, you need to submit to us. And he kind of does, like I was talking about, he does that little bullshit submission to him. But while he's doing this bullshit submission to him, he starts essentially raiding Ottoman camps. He would go into these camps dressed like an Ottoman. Remember, he was raised by the Ottomans, essentially. He spoke Turkish. He knew all their customs and shit like that. So he would go into these little Ottoman camps that were near Wallachia, and he would figure out where all the shit was. He would leave, and he would do this in the middle of the night. And remember, this is no night vision goggles. If you want to see a night, then you have to use a torch, but then everyone else can see that torch too. So he's doing this in the middle of the night. He would go into these camps, see what was up there, and then he would just do a full-on fucking invasion into the camp and kill literally everybody. And so the Ottomans didn't know about this for a while because Vlad III was just killing everybody in the camps. He captured a ton of people as well, but for the most part, there was no one left in the camps, or no one alive left in the camps to tell the story that Vlad III was doing this. And so eventually the Ottomans do catch on to this. And so they're like, fuck it. We're just gonna invade Wallachia. So they invade. I think there was a little bit of skirmishes and stuff like that. But eventually Vlad, he just ends up falling back the entire time. He's just tactically retreating the entire time. He goes back, he ends up in Hungary eventually, but on his way, he falls back through Targoviste, the capital, tells everyone, get the fuck out of this place. And he also, when he's retreating, he's doing scorched earth, burning everything to the ground. So the Ottoman forces are starving. And then on the march to Torgaviste, they see 20,000 impaled Ottomans that Vlad had captured or killed during those little raids that I was talking about. 20,000 impaled dudes. And then they get to Tergaviste being like, oh, we're going to get all this money. We're going to be able to plunder and loot and rape and, do whatever we want to do. They get there and it's basically fucking abandoned. And this event shocked Mehmed, Mehmed was the dude who had captured Constantinople. And if you don't know, Constantinople is like the hardest fucking city to capture on the face of the planet. It was able to hold out for so long against so many various different forces. He captured it. This dude was known as, his name was Mehmed II, and then later on in life, or maybe after he died, I don't know, he became known as Mehmed the Conqueror. There's a few conquerors throughout history. There's like William the Conqueror, I guess Alexander is Alexander the Great, but you could call him Alexander the Conqueror. And then there's fucking Mehmed, dude. He's like one of 3 dudes who gets the Conqueror title in his name. And this event shocked him so much that he almost just gave up. He almost just gave up invading as a whole. Like, that's how much this fucked him and all of his troops up. Like, and not just the troops, right? Mehmed himself was almost like, Jesus fucking Christ, dude. Everyone's starving. People are dying of disease and fucking exposure and stuff like that. Then he sees 20,000 impaled dudes, and he's like, we just got to make it through these impaled dudes, and then we're going to be able to take this city and steal all the shit from it and be rich and stuff like that. And he gets to the city to find it fucking abandoned. He literally almost quit because of this, and this is from like Ottoman sources and stuff like that. This isn't, some Romanian source telling some like grand mythological story. This is himself. He was like, fuck, dude, I might have to give up. And so I guess I'll talk a little bit more about Vlad III and his family drama, because I listened to his story for 2 hours. So Dracula isn't really part of his name at all. It was this thing in Hungary. Like I said, they kind of have a tenuous relationship with Wallachia and the other Romanian kingdoms, but they can get along decently well at times if need be. Like I said, Romanians are always going to serve their own interests, but that can be predictable. You can work with that. You can't work with some, unpredictable fucking psychopath. You can work with dudes who are selfish, right? And so Vlad II ends up joining the Order of the Dragon. Pretty sick name. And the word for dragon in Hungarian is Dracula. And so that's where the term Dracula comes from. These guys aren't even Transylvanian, they're fucking Wallachian. Basically, when Bram Stoker, is that the guy's name? I don't fucking remember. Bam Stoker? Is it Bam Stoker? Yeah, Bam. Is it Bam Margera Stoker? I don't know. Whatever his name is, when he ends up writing Dracula, he just thought the name Dracula sounded pretty cool. He does kind of base it a little bit on Vlad III, but not really. He just thinks Dracula sounds cool, and he thinks Transylvania sounds cool. So when people are like, Vlad III is the inspiration for Dracula, kinda, but not fully, right? Not really. But he was a super effective fucking guy. He was really effective. Eventually, like I was talking about earlier, his brother Radu, who goes on to be Radu the Handsome, he ends up being the puppet state leader of Wallachia for a little while. Because when Vlad III is doing all his retreats through Wallachia, he ends up going to Hungary, and he gets arrested in Hungary because the king of Hungary wanted to be the king of the Holy Roman Empire, right? He was like making a bid. I don't know the exact politics of it, but for some reason the king of Hungary was a potential emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and so he ends up arresting Vlad because he doesn't want to deal with his bullshit anymore, which pisses off Vlad, and he actually keeps him in prison for a while. But anyway, not important. Not important. All you gotta know is this particular piece of psychological warfare was super fucking effective. Like I said, the Ottomans do end up getting Wallachia, kind of turning it into a puppet state a little bit. But as we know now, Romania isn't Muslim, so they do end up holding out. Like I said, the people there are super fucking hard-headed. They're very similar to the Russians in a lot of ways in terms of their warfare, but also their, ethnic, cultural, religious pride that they have. They're very hard-headed people. And so overall, medieval Romanian warfare was based on, I would say most importantly, the loyalty of its soldiers, mobile defense, and avoidance of open combat because they were usually outnumbered. That's ultimately what it comes down to. So it was guerrilla warfare, but it was medieval guerrilla warfare, which is pretty fucking sick and also a lot more brutal, I'd say, in some ways than modern guerrilla warfare. I can't think of an instance in modern guerrilla warfare where a dude put 20,000 people on spikes. But Vlad III did it. And so next up, we're talking about kind of one of the epitomes. I would say Vlad III impaling all these dudes on these spikes, and then immediately after he does that, he does the night raid, I think it was called, where basically in the middle of the night, he does that thing where he sneaks into the Ottoman camp, but this isn't some shitty little Ottoman camp. This is like a big old Ottoman camp. This is where Mehmed is at. And he thinks he finds Mehmed's tent, and so he goes back to his dudes, and then he invades the camp in the middle of the night, thinks he kills Mehmed, doesn't kill Mehmed. He kills some other, like, high-level type of dude. And then, obviously, Mehmed does what Mehmed does, and he conquers. Conquered Wallachia, kind of, but not really. Not in the way that he conquered, the Byzantines and Constantinople and stuff like that. But anyway, Stephen the Great is who we're talking about. Talk about Alexander the Great. Stephen the Great, he doesn't conquer the entire known world like Alexander does. But if you're Romanian, I'd say, if you're Romanian, then this guy Stephen is pretty great. And we're going to talk a little bit about his life story, but we're going to talk specifically about the Battle of Vaslui, I think is how you pronounce it. It's Vaslui. I'm saying Vaslui. So Stephen the Great was born in 1433 to the ruling family of Moldavia, and early on in his life, his father was assassinated. Goddamn. Got. Like I said, medieval politics at this time, Moldavia was pretty stable, especially compared to Wallachia. But yeah, this could just fucking happen back in the day. It happens now. And so his dad gets assassinated, and Stephen was exiled before returning in 1457. So he's 22, I guess, at that point, and reclaiming his throne with some support from Wallachia. It didn't really say where he got exiled to. I'm sure he just pulled up to Wallachia and he was like, "Yo, dude, what's up? What's going on? Can I chill here for a little bit before I go reclaim my throne? Cool. Teach me military tactics because I really want that throne back." And so yeah, that's kind of the setup for Stephen the Great. And he does some other things. So obviously he's fighting the Ottomans. Ottomans are trying to push into Christendom, take over Europe and all that good stuff. And Wallachia and Moldavia, they're kind of the front line of defense for that. So he ends up fighting with the Ottomans a lot. And I think one of the big reasons he becomes known as Stephen the Great is not only because of his resistance to the Ottomans, but he's the guy that builds all those fortified monasteries in the mountains of Moldavia, which a monastery, if you don't know, it's like it's where monks live, right? That's what a monastery is. And he ends up being, I think he's canonized as a saint in the Orthodox tradition. A lot of the saints in Catholicism are saints in Orthodoxy, but I don't think Stephen the Great is a as a saint in Catholicism. Because I think the main reason they made him a saint, not only is his defense against the Ottomans, but also because he built all these monasteries and stuff like that. So yeah, he was confirmed as an Orthodox saint in 2000. Damn, it took him a minute, dude. It took Stephen the Great a minute to become a saint. I don't know, maybe the Orthodox process is longer, but a lot of Catholic saints get canonized right after they die. But anyway, he does end up becoming a saint. So, like I said, after the fall of Constantinople, the Ottomans pushed into Eastern Europe and forced smaller states like Moldavia to pay tribute and submit. Like I said, they also do it to Wallachia. Really, those are the only two places that I think they end up getting. I do think they maybe do reach out and touch Hungary a little bit. Yeah, they definitely do. They definitely get up in Hungary. But that's a whole different bag of beans. Okay? It's a whole different bag of beans. But basically, them taking Constantinople, which, like I said, impossible fucking city to take, dude. Mehmed was just a beast. I hate to give the guy credit. I don't know. I still have that Catholicism in me, like I said. Hating the Ottomans, hating the enemy. I'm ready to go on crusade. But he does end up reaching out, touching Hungary, but really more importantly than that is taking Constantinople. I think when he was taking Constantinople, he used like cannons and shit like that, which at this point in history, this is like early guns. They do have that. There's this guy named Jan Ziska. He's up in, I talked about him earlier, he's up in Bohemia. He uses guns, invents field artillery and stuff like that. But that's not super important to what we're talking about here. Anyway, Mehmed's conquering. Look, they don't call him Mehmed the fucking Conqueror for no reason. If he was sitting around stroking his dick all day, they'd call him Mehmed the Gooner. But he wasn't doing that, he was conquering, so they call him Mehmed the Conqueror. When this happened in Moldavia, Stephen does pay tribute. He like literally pays the Ottomans, but he refused to fully submit. And while he's refusing to fully submit, he's strengthening his defenses and resisting Ottoman control. Strengthening his defenses, what I mean by that is he's building all those monasteries. He's also giving money to other anti-Ottoman, kingdoms and tribes and whatever they have out there during this time. So the Ottomans are like, they're kind of a little bit pissed off at him. They can see the writing on the wall. But the spark that lights the fire is Stephen being like, fuck you. We're not paying tribute anymore. So not only has he not fully submitted, but now he's just stopping paying them tribute. So the Ottomans are like, okay, you want to play this fucking game? Mehmed invaded Moldavia with 60 to 100,000 soldiers to reassert control and send a message. But we know the Romanians are fucking hard-headed. So Stephen, being massively outnumbered, he's just hiding in the mountains, basically. He's avoiding head-on control or head-on confrontations, and instead he lures the Ottomans to a place called Podul and Nolt. I don't know. It's one of those things that, or maybe it's Podul and Nolt. I don't really know. But it means the High Bridge, which is near the town of Vaslui. And so this place, Podul and Nolt, it's like this super marshy valley and stuff like that, which, if you know anything about Agincourt, horses, especially horses that have armor on them, and especially horses that are armored and having dudes ride on them who are armored, do not do well in the mud, in, bogs and things like that. We also talked about Bannockburn. That's kind of another instance of this same strategy of being like, I don't have any heavy cavalry or as much heavy cavalry, so I'm going to fight you in the mud, where that advantage of having heavy cavalry is not only negated, but also becomes a negative, because these dudes are in armor, these horses are in armor, they're getting bogged down in the mud. And it's also a pretty narrow place, so they're kind of at a bottleneck. And so Stephen used I've also heard it Stefan, I don't know if it's Stephen or Stefan, whatever the guy's name is. He's the great. He uses the terrain and fog to hide several small groups, each with local initiative. And local initiative basically is like fire at will. So Steven has a bunch of dudes hiding behind hills, hiding in the trees, hiding behind the fog. And he's like, attack whenever the fuck you want to attack, but you're Romanians. I know you guys want to fight. I trust you. So attack when you want to attack. And these independent units, this is a little bit of psychological warfare. So the reason this exemplifies it so much is he's not really doing siege warfare. He's negating the heavy cavalry and also not using it himself. He's kind of letting the Ottomans into his land. He doesn't like meet them at the border and fight them there. So he's giving up land for time. And then this is the psychological warfare. So these independent units used horns and drums to disorient the fucking Ottoman forces before attacking in waves from multiple angles. So, like I was talking about earlier, traditionally the way it was set up was you had a line here and you had a line here. And so these Ottomans kind of thought that Stephen had like a huge fucking line of people, when in reality it was just a bunch of different little separate groups. And they didn't attack all at once. You know, one group would come out blasting horns, you know what I mean, going full Louis Armstrong, beating some dudes to death. Then another group of dudes would come out, the horses are getting fucked up. Everything gets fucked up, basically, for the Ottomans. So this, disorienting them with the horns and the drums and stuff like that, coming at them from all angles, this dissolved Ottoman coordination along with the terrain and caused the Ottomans to fall back in a chaotic retreat. Ottomans end up pulling out of Moldavia as a whole, giving the kingdom temporary independence, till Mehmed returned a year later. Mehmed does not give up. We might have to do an episode about Mehmed. The dude just does not fucking quit. He's a dog. Gotta give it to the guy. He's a fucking dog. So that's medieval Romanian warfare. It's kind of just medieval guerrilla warfare, but with a little bit of other shit mixed in there. A little bit of ethnic and religious loyalty. So that's all I got for this episode. You guys, I hope everyone listening has a good day, a good week, a good year, a good life. Turns out gypsies aren't that bad after all. Ping.